Throughout the semester in LA 299, we learned about propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation, but not necessarily in the way that I thought we would before taking the class. That was until we had a class about conspiracy theories. And our professor, being the open-minded guy he is, asked the class, what conspiracy theories do you guys believe in and why? So throughout the class, I, being the extroverted and opinionated person I am, gave some of the reasons why I believe, for example, 9/11, which was one that he asked us about, wasn't necessarily what we were led to believe it was. And we had a great discussion, and at the end of the class, the professor actually challenged me to do a presentation and prove why I believe in the conspiracy theories, or even just the notion of conspiracy theories. And thus, we have my presentation. So, before delving into this, I'd like to pose a couple questions. For one, what is a conspiracy theory? What is misinformation? What is disinformation? And the definition given by Merriam-Webster for conspiracy theory is on the board. However, when I thought about it in a deeper sense, for something to be misinformation or disinformation, which for those who don't know, the definition is false information that is either inadvertently or advertently spread, doesn't that lead to the conclusion that there is true information? And that begs the question, who gets to determine what is true? Is it the government? Is it the media? Is it the people? Well, in my regard, and what I felt with the presentation of this topic in the class, is that whomever even questions or disagrees with what the government may tell them, the United States government that is, they're labeled as crazy or delusional, believing in hoaxes even. And I propose that this may not be as true as we'd like it to believe, in that the government is not always telling us the truth as much as we'd like it to believe. And I may argue that it perhaps could be even more crazy to believe in a government that has been proven to lie for countless times, leading to not only hundreds of thousands, but even millions of deaths over the last 100 years alone. Thus, I would like to present this conversation with as much evidence as I can, citing mostly declassified documents, which obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, display what the government actually knew or did not know. And I would like to ask another question, in that, do conspiracy theories extend to wars? In that, is a war that has been proven to be carried out under false pretenses a conspiracy? And would that be a conspiracy theory or a conspiracy fact? And the primary focus in a lot of these cases that I will present is to do with casus belli, which refers to the justification or reason for entering a war. And a lot of the times we'd find that these justifications were not only untrue, but also intentionally deceptive. So the first case I'd like to look at is the case of the Vietnam War. And for those who know, this is one of the most violent and gruesome wars in American history, perhaps even, at least within the last 50 years, one of the most gruesome wars in mankind has experienced. So the cause of the war, the reason that we went into it, was that allegedly there was an attack on the USS Maddox by Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 4th, 1964. And the reaction to this, less than 3 days later, under President Nixon's imposition, Congress approved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution on August 7th. The outcome to this was that up to 3 million people died, over 50% being innocent Vietnamese civilians, the remainder being Viet Cong and US soldiers. And unfortunately, what we now know, because of a declassified study on the Gulf of Tonkin released early in 2001 by an NSA historian Robert J. Hanyok, and that is National Security Administration, displays that the attack actually did not occur. And that at the time, the government knew of this. They knew that the evidence for this attack was faulty. And when reinforcements came, they did not find a ship. They did not find any Vietnamese ships there. And thus, this serves as, I think, a large case study, large example, not only because America lost this war, and thus it sticks more in the American consciousness, but also due to the sheer number of casualties and violence that was enacted under a false pretense. So, moving on, this one I find to be a little more comedic, not in terms of what happened, but in terms of looking back how unreal the deception was. And the claimed cause of this war was, this is a quote by Representative Henry Hyde, actually given in a congressional hearing, was to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator, that being Saddam Hussein, whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and ripped babies from the incubators in Kuwait. And I'd like to show a video which this representative is referring to. And this testimony, if you could click the link. Could get the link for it. Thank you. This testimony, people.
What I saw happen to the children.
This testimony was given by a young girl who said she was a nurse in Kuwait at the time of the Iraq invasion. And now looking back, it's hard to understand how important and integral something like this was, in that giving a human face to a foreign conflict increased massively United States citizens' interest in going to war. As there was a documentary which I recommend whoever is watching to check out. It's called To Sell a War, on this topic. And they basically inferred how the vast majority of Americans couldn't point out Kuwait on a map, let alone would they want to send their soldiers overseas. So this was very integral for the inquisition of this war, and if you could play.
Children of Kuwait, unto my country has changed my life forever. It has changed the life of all Kuwaitis, young and old. We are children no more. My sister, with my 5-day-old nephew, traveled across the desert to safety. There was no milk available for the baby in Kuwait. They barely escaped when their car was stuck in the desert sand, and help came from Saudi Arabia. I stayed behind and wanted to do something for my country. The second week after the invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Sabah hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well. After I left the hospital.
So, after seeing that, it's quite moving. However, quite unfortunately, this nurse volunteer, Nayirah, actually was discovered shortly after to be Nayirah Al-Sabah, daughter of Saud Al-Sabah, who was actually the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Her testimony had been written for her by a PR agency named Hill & Knowlton, hired by an AstroTurf organization named Citizens for a Free Kuwait, and that is a fake organization. AstroTurf, as in fake grass, is set up by Kuwaiti government to represent a real grassroots organization. And this congressional hearing was made actually in a studio. So This just displays that when the United States has a desire to go to war, they are willing and they have created an entire false testimony, an entire false exigence to motivate the civilians, the citizens, to support the war. So the outcome of this was that Kuwait was liberated from Iraq, and U.S. maintained their relations with Saudi Arabia. As Nayirah mentioned, this was probably, I don't want to say, I'm not here to say what the reasons were. I'm not here to impose any insider knowledge. I'm just going to tell you what the outcome was. So yeah, this was in 1990. Now this leads to 9/11, the great controversial terror attack, which led to, unfortunately, a lot of suffering and death in the Middle East in a war on terror. And the official narrative is that Al-Qaeda terrorists, Mohammed Atta, Abdulaziz Al-Amari, 3 others hijacked 3 commercial airliners, flying 2 into the Twin Towers and 1 into the Pentagon, and tragically 3,000 civilians were killed. The reaction to this, in this quote given only less than 3 weeks after the event by George Bush, is that every nation in every region now has a decision to make. He said in a national address, either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. And thus it was a global war launched in that NATO agreed the day after 9/11, or they had a conference the day after 9/11, and shortly thereafter they agreed that an attack from a foreign body on the United States was an attack on all of NATO. So the United States and NATO declared war eventually, or shortly thereafter, on Afghanistan. They linked Afghanistan as being, and Al-Qaeda as being the perpetrators. And this ultimately led to the death of 4.5 million people in the Middle East. And so I want to take a moment here and I want to emphasize this as the main reason why discussions on these topics are so important. Not to emphasize that one person I may know more than someone else, or that we shouldn't believe anything the government says, but when millions of people's lives are at stake, why is it that it's crazy to have questions, or it's crazy to want to know, to look deeper into things for yourself? And I initially intended on giving a lot of evidence as to, for example, how it was initially claimed that the terrorists were identified by their passports, which were in pristine condition, and I was going to show that and say, oh, to me that doesn't make sense if a building or plane through a building. But I'd rather just leave it and say, even if we take this as absolutely true, is this justified? Is it justified to launch war on Afghanistan and subsequently 4 other countries in the Middle East, which leads to the death of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians because of attack by a few people? And for the Americans, ironically, or interestingly, forgive me, the Patriot Act was signed into law only 45 days after 9/11, which we now know has not been repealed, and has led to increased spying on Americans by the NSA and massive invasions of privacy in the name of safety and preventing terrorism. So again, I just thought that was interesting. Next. Following the 9/11 terror attacks, as I mentioned, there were subsequent wars, and the one which had the most evidence to prove my claim of under false pretenses is the Iraq War, which is actually a notoriously misrepresented war, in that those who lived through it remember the insane scares of weapons of mass destruction. And George Bush said, actually, we know for sure Saddam Hussein has links to Al-Qaeda. We can prove they have weapons of mass destruction. We have to go and stop them. The same with the Vietnam War, I forgot to mention. We have to go and stop communism. It's our obligation, it's our duty. So this again ultimately led to the death of 250,000 to 350,000 innocent civilians. This is only, I want to mention that these are direct military conflicts alone. So not even factoring in the destabilization of the regions, even in all these other conflicts, even in Vietnam, the people who died from hunger, for example. But yeah, so from 2003 till now, 200,000 to 300,000 people were murdered, or I take it as murdered in Iraq. And unfortunately, the conspiracy fact is that the weapons of mass destruction were never found. And a declassified document released in 2015 displayed that the NIE, which is the, I think, National Intelligence, I can't remember, I'm sorry, lacked specific information on many key aspects of Saddam Hussein's WMD program in 2002, and this was just ignored. It was ignored, and at the time, fear is instilled into civilians. And we covered this in class, interestingly enough, that propaganda is used to instill emotions, because when you have an emotional populace, they are far more likely to support something that they may not support if they're thinking logically. And yeah, again, the question remains, was it worth it? Next slide. So I just want to take a moment and mention some notable conspiracy theorists, or conspiracy theorists. A lot of these don't fit that narrative, but just to display the main purpose of my presentation, in that how do we frame this discussion? And so maybe the most admirable, some people would say, in society's eyes, in this is Muhammad Ali, who was very famously refused to fight in Vietnam because he did not support the war. And I just want to point out how, at the time, Muhammad Ali was labeled a traitor. He was stripped of his championship belts, and he was convicted by the court and labeled for, I think, unpatriotism, and obviously for refusing the draft. But now, when we look back, we acknowledge Muhammad Ali as a hero, because now we know that this was a vicious war. There wasn't a strong enough reason for America to go fight there, but at the time, Muhammad Ali was persecuted. And I have Alex Jones up here, and he was acknowledged in our class as a crazy guy multiple times by the professor. And I completely understand. I'm not here to say every conspiracy is true, everything any of these people support is true. However, very interestingly, Alex Jones was telling people that there is a billionaire with an orgy island who traffics children there up to 20 years ago. And because, oh, what are you talking about, man? That sounds crazy, you're a nut job. But he was right. His name was Jeffrey Epstein. And now today, not only is Jeffrey Epstein no longer alive, for whatever reason that may be, the Epstein list has still not been released, so we still don't know exactly the details of who was on those planes to his island. But my point is, just because no matter how crazy something may sound, even if, let's say, Alex Jones was wrong about 100 claims, but just got that one right, we may have, or society may have suffered by not hearing every claim out and doing the due diligence to find what is the truth. And in hindsight, it's easy to say that this could have changed something, but I just find it interesting. Who knows the next crazy conspiracy that will be proven to be true 20 years from now that we're disregarding because of how it sounds. Also, I have Julian Assange here and Edward Snowden, and they're whistleblowers more than anything. But again, just to prove my point that the information, or once the information they released was available to the public, all these crazy conspiracies all of a sudden turned out to be true. So even, and this might sound like a counterintuitive sense, but I guess even if we don't have the information, we shouldn't be so quick to believe everything we're told. Some suspicion may be warranted sometimes, especially as the point of this presentation is to display that we have a lot of evidence for times that they did lie, or the government did lie to you. And I also had a section about the CIA, which I removed because it didn't really fit the theme, but I would like to mention with the CIA, what is interesting we talked about in class is that a lot of people back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, conspiracy theorists, or people were labeled conspiracy theorists who believed in aliens and mentioned alien abductions and whatnot. I was like, oh, you're crazy. But now, the CIA and Area 51 themselves released saying, yeah, there was UFOs the whole time. And we had a bunch of documents about it. So again, who gets to determine what is the truth? And I'm not saying that it's for me to determine, but I do understand that if I care about the truth, it's absolutely my responsibility to seek it out. And that leads to the most important aspect of my presentation, in that a scenario just like these ones I've mentioned is taking place right now as we speak. If you could hit the next slide. That is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And for those who do not know, I'm actually a Palestinian Muslim myself. And to me, none of this has come as too much of a surprise, because growing up, my parents would show me videos saying, hey, look what's happening in Palestine. Look at what's happening in Gaza. So I was aware of this. However, again, with the way the conversation is framed, the history of what this conflict entails is unbeknown to many, to most even. So this slide, I just want to give a quick rundown, very, very summarized, in that Jewish people were welcomed into Palestine from the end of the 1800s to 1948, following many known conflicts in Europe, like World War I and World War II. And the state of Israel was established in 1948. But what a lot of people don't know is that how this occurred was through, and this is acknowledged by historians, was through multiple violent massacres called the Nakba massacres, which began in the village of Balad al-Sheikh on December 31, 1947, which was the first of 5 to take place. And this ultimately led to the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, which was over 80% of the population of Palestine at the time, and an estimated 15,000 being murdered. And this was the exigence of which the Israeli state was established. So, be that as it may, after this, Palestinians who were within Israel were subject to martial law, and those who were expulsed from Israel were not allowed to return. And Israel occupation of Palestine began in 1967, and Palestine being the lands that they had been pushed to, and Palestinians have been under oppression in this region ever since. Okay, the next slide, please. So, bringing us to October 7th, and I want to see, after giving a couple examples, if we could see any similarities with this current event with what I have presented earlier. So the initial claim after October 7th was that these Hamas terrorists, for those who don't know, Hamas is a resistance organization, but it's very interesting, if you label them terrorists, no matter what they do, no matter what's their reasoning, they're automatically bad. But if, from a Palestinian perspective, are they terrorists? If they're just fighting back for that which was taken from them. But regardless, Hamas terrorists attack Israel completely unprovoked for no reason at all, killing 1,500 civilians, beheading babies, and assaulting innocent women and children. That was the claim. And so the reaction, again, following the precedent of earlier examples and wars, is that we must retaliate with full force. We should drop bombs from the sky on one of the most densely populated areas on the face of the earth that is filled with 50% children. This is the logical retaliation for a terror attack. We should blow up innocent men, women, and children. And the outcome is that since October 7th till now, over 18,000 Palestinians have been murdered. Nearly 50,000 have been injured. Several war crimes have been committed by international regulations set by the UN, for example, bombing hospitals, bombing mosques, and killing innocent civilians, or blatant disregard for the safety of innocent civilians, which is exactly what dropping bombs on the most densely populated strip of land on the earth is. And collective punishment, which is also against international law, where Israel, for example, cutting off electricity and water to the civilians in Palestine to pay for the actions of Hamas terrorists, that is collective punishment. So what turned out to be, or the conspiracy aspect, which I put in quotes just to display the later facts in response to the initial reporting, is that Social Security data displays that only nearly 700 Israeli civilians were killed, as opposed to 1,500. Nearly 373 were security forces out of a total of 1,139, and 73 foreigners. Not that they don't matter. So we have nearly 800 civilians killed in this conflict, but compare that to 1,500. And no babies were found to be beheaded, which I found this really interesting, drawing back to the Gulf War, how extremely heinous acts against, for example, a baby is used as a false claim to, support a war, to support whatever. I found it very interesting, the similarity. If I can get the last slide, please. So to conclude, what is the real purpose with this? Because at first I wanted to just prove the conspiracies that I was debating my professor with to be true, to show how smart I was, or to show that he was wrong and I was right. But when I really delved deep, I was like, you know what, there's a deeper thing here. And if I was speaking to my classmates, what would I want them to take away? I want them to take away that each of us has an innate responsibility to ensure what we believe is true actually is, before even giving an opinion, because me personally, I wouldn't like to give opinions on that which I'm uneducated on, but especially before supporting or condoning actions with which innocent lives hang in the balance, like war, I think that's the biggest thing. Secondly, not everything authority figures tell us is true actually is, nor is everything they tell us is false actually false. Why do we expect or even uphold these institutions to the highest level of truth when we know they have lied to us? And after all, they're just composed of humans. And humans are not inherently honest, but we treat them as if they are. And when a conflict happens that doesn't make sense, we attribute it towards careless disregard, or what's the word? We take it as an accident, but it could be on purpose. Maybe they have, alternative intentions. And lastly, we shouldn't be so quick to disregard and discredit people based on what may appear to be outlandish or crazy in the present moment, as has been shown. For example, what is taken to be true in the moment is not always the case, and what appears to be false in the moment is not always the case. And so, applying this to other conspiracy theories, like, for example, the moon landing not being real. If someone told that to me and I believed it was real, I'd be like, you know what, what's your evidence? Why do you believe that? Just like my beloved professor did to me. And that's why I'm so happy to have given this presentation. I hope that you learned something in watching this, in that no one is immune to being lied to, and there's nothing wrong with being lied to. But I believe there is something wrong with willfully persisting in false beliefs just because we don't want to go and put in the effort to search out the truth. And I believe society, my students, my classmates, if I could speak to them, I would tell them we would all be far better off if we chose to educate ourselves with the proper effort with regard to serious issues, and issues that aren't as serious but perhaps have far-reaching implications, like, for example, the moon landing. But yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you for watching. Hope everyone has a good day.